what we figured out about what memories are. And I always like to start with this clip, which probably some of you might be able to identify, but some of you perhaps not. This is from the movie Ratatouille. So this is the food critic tasting the restaurant's ratatouille. And from a neuroscience perspective, what we see is a gustatory, olfactory experience where he's tasting things. And suddenly there's this amazing mental time travel where this taste has driven him back to his past, where he remembers coming in from outside, he remembers his mother feeding him, taking care of him. This entire thing comes back to him, what he saw, what he felt, and it does so in a flash, right? And these memories have a rather profound impact on all of us. In fact, these memories, in some very important sense, are what make us, are a large part of what make us who we are. And so I feel like this is really what we're trying to understand. And I guess just to put this in context, presumably you're all here not just to spend 2 hours of your life, but if you forgot all of this tomorrow, you probably would think this was kind of a waste of time, right? The purpose of coming here is partially to make memories, right? You might want to enjoy the experience, but if you left afterwards and nothing was left in your head, that probably wouldn't work out. And in fact, much of what we do all the time is making memories. When we meet people, when we go to conferences, when we walk around, we are making memories in ourselves. And again, we do this because memories are really important. They're the things that allow us to sort of guide our lives. And so what we're trying to figure out in my lab and many others is what these things are. And a lot of the clues to what these are actually have come originally from patients. So I want to show you a couple of videos. This is from a Scientific American Frontiers. This is an interview. The woman is a graduate student interviewing a man who's had damage to the parts of the brain that are critical for forming and retrieving memories. So I'll just let you listen for a moment.
Why should people pay taxes?
To support the country and their counties and states to pay for things.
If you were lost in the forest during the day, how would you go about finding your way out?
I would find a river and follow the river down to wherever it may go. Ocean, lake.
EP can also copy complex drawings.
That is.
And he not only has no difficulty repeating back a list of words, in this case, dog, raccoon, lion, and parrot.
Dog, raccoon, lion, and a parrot. Hey,
But he even has a little sly fun with Jen along the way.
what you gotta have is about 2 more.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Would that be a good helper?
And that would catch them. You know, leave. Medicine.
EP really hits his stride when the testing of his cognitive skills involves Jen's laptop computer.
Gold. Having been in electronics over the years, I am amazed at all this. It's just wonderful. Believe me, little printed circuits, just, oh, you can't believe it. It used to be in a 6-foot rack, and down to this, it's just wonderful. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack.
But it's now that something odd about EP's behavior becomes apparent.
Printed circuits, diodes, triodes, and all that stuff in there. Oh, it's just amazing, believe me. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. It would be in a couple 6-foot racks. It would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. And now look at it, down to this little printed circuit.
Okay. So a couple of things to notice, right? First, he seems totally normal at first, right? His interactions, he's funny, he's a really sweet guy, actually. So you can have a perfectly normal conversation with him, but a few minutes later, out comes the same thing, right? Over and over and over again. And of course, this is happening because he doesn't remember what he said. And in fact, he doesn't remember that he doesn't remember, because you can't remember that you don't remember unless you can remember, right? So this is kind of, is also an indication for all of us that in fact, for all of us to function in our daily lives, we have to be constantly creating memories of everything we say and do, because otherwise we'd end up repeating ourselves, right? And this is actually one of the most remarkable things to me about how our brains work, is that they're constantly doing this, right? I can ask any of you, what did you do for breakfast? Unless you're massively stressed out of your mind, you can tell me. Right? And that's despite the fact that you didn't think this morning, oh, I'm going to this thing tonight and he's going to ask me about breakfast, right? Or at least I hope not. But yet that information is sitting there in your head, and that's just, to me, quite remarkable. So a little more about him.
I read you some words about 15 minutes ago. 4 of them. 4 words. You remember me reading you 4 words?
No, I can't
No?
recall, I'm sorry.
That's okay. No need to
My
apologize.
mind is getting old.
That's okay. I read you 4 animals, and I want you to tell me yes if you think the animal was on the list I read you about 15 minutes ago, or no if it was not on the list, okay? Cat.
Yes,
How sure are you?
I feel reasonably sure on that
Reasonably
cat.
sure? Uh-huh. Raccoon.
No, no, I feel no.
Giraffe.
Yes,
How sure are you that I read
I'm
you
real
that?
sure on that.
Real sure?
They're beautiful animals,
Okay.
believe me.
Lion.
No,
Okay.
Okay. So to be fair, they did pick out a chunk where he was 0 for 4, right? So it's not like he was below chance, if that's, if any of you are worried about that. But there are a couple of really important points, right? So he says, I'm getting old. Again, he's sort of making up a story as to why he doesn't remember this thing. He trusts her that she's telling the truth, and he makes up a story. And then, however, he goes on to say that he has a lot of confidence about these things, which of course he can have no confidence about, right? And I showed this mostly because this is an incredibly important thing about our memories, is we often don't know how wrong they are, right? This comes up in eyewitness testimony, this comes up in all sorts of different areas of life. But if you actually study this and you look at how the literature, it's amazing how inaccurate our memories are, particularly around peripheral things, like details other than the central fact of this. And I have personally found, and I recommend this to others, that keeping in mind the fallibility of memory, even your own memory, is extraordinarily good for your personal relationships. So I'll just mention that. All right. So what's happening? Why is EP unable to form memories? So a lot of this revolves around this structure here called the hippocampus. So this is sort of an artist view, well, not a great artist admittedly, but an artist view of sort of the human brain. The eyes would be down here. This is the back of the head. This is the cerebellum. And this blinking structure is called the hippocampus. It's called the hippocampus because it looks like a seahorse, and the old anatomists had no idea what any of these parts of the brain did, so they called them based on what they look like. So you can kind of see it wrapping around here in a sort of seahorse shape. This little round thing at the end is called the amygdala. Amygdala means almond, because for those of you who have ever seen an almond in its shell, which most of you probably haven't, but I suggest looking at one, that's kind of what it looks like. And this is an area fundamentally important for emotion, and you can see it's right off the end of the hippocampus, right? Emotion and memory often go together. And so in EP, this area and some of the brain cortex, this other stuff around it, was completely destroyed when he was about 70 years old by a disease, and that's why he can't form memories anymore. And so what I want to do is tell you a little bit about how we think that works and how what we've learned about what memories might be in the brain. All right, so if we think about a memory, we can even think about tonight. Hopefully you will all be recording some memories of this event, and so how is that happening? Well, so right now, my voice is a series of pressure waves in the air. It's going into your ears, wiggling a little membrane, which is wiggling some bones, which is sloshing some fluid around. This is literally what's happening in all of you all the time. And that's making little hair cells wiggle like that, which turns into electrical impulses that go into the brain. And these things get processed in many areas and end up in the center part of the brain, the outer part called the cortex, and different modalities like vision and hearing and smell and so on, each go to separate areas, all right? So these areas basically figure out what it is you're seeing and hearing and smelling, right? That's why we're all able to parse our world. And they can change with experience, right? You can see this, for example, in someone who knows a lot about wine, right? They've learned to recognize things, smells, and so on, that many of the rest of us, particularly those of us on academic salaries who can't afford a lot of good wine, don't really notice. But even though these things can change, they don't change quickly, all right? And empirically, if you only have these areas, you can't form memories for the events of daily life. Now, this is a really good thing. You don't want these parts of your brain to rewire them all the time, because then every time you tasted something or smelled something, it would smell different, right? The way things taste or smell or look is based on how they're processed by all of these incredible numbers of neurons talking to each other in the brain, and the stability of that is what gives stability to our own perceptions. And so fortunately for us, evolution worked out this cool trick. This is something we call encoding, where this information is passed through many other parts of the brain on the way to the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is a place where you get amazingly rapid plasticity. And what I mean by that is that the connections between neurons, which we think are where information is stored, and sort of the weights or the strengths of these connections, can change incredibly quickly. So these connections in all of your heads, in theory at least, are changing right now, all the time to encode information about what I'm saying and to therefore create a memory of this event. All right? Now, this is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. The hippocampus is a little bit like a child, all right, in the following way. Now, my kids at the moment are 6 and almost 11, and I can see this particularly in my 6-year-old, is he learns stuff really quickly, but he also forgets really quickly. All right, so he can, learn all sorts of things about a particular kind of animal or dinosaurs or dragons, which is his current favorite thing, and then a year from now, that may all be gone. All right, and the reason is that his brain is unbelievably plastic, so it can change a lot to encode this new information, but then other stuff comes in and washes that old information out and puts new stuff in. The hippocampus, we think, is just like that. It's a place where stuff can get stored quickly, but it's also a place where things can get overwritten. And so there's actually a process to prevent that from happening, right? Because otherwise we'd forget things all the time. I'm going to talk about this in 2 contexts in terms of how this process works. And the first way to understand this is first to understand a little bit about how these memories are retrieved in this circuit, all right? So if I go back to that example I mentioned before, so think about what you had for breakfast, okay? So again, literally, if we think about what's going on in your head, information is going in, your auditory areas are figuring out what it is I said, and they're basically sending a signal to the hippocampus to say, hey, he asked me about breakfast, help me remember that. All right? And literally, we think the hippocampus is acting a bit like an orchestra conductor, saying, okay, you parts of the brain associated with figuring out what things tasted like and what you remember what my breakfast tasted like. And you other parts of the brain with, associated with where I was, remember my kitchen table and all the things I saw. And all of you come on together, and that is literally the act of reinstating the memory. All right? And we know every time you remember something, you remember it a little better next time. All right? That's why we study for tests. That's why we repeat things to ourselves, is memories are enhanced by repetition, right? We all sort of learned this in school. And so this is the first thing that happens. Every time we retrieve a memory, we cement it in these other areas a little bit. The hippocampus in this case is acting a bit like a teacher. So not only is it pulling the memory up, but it's cementing it in over and over again, causing the slower areas here to sort of catch on over and over again. And this process is often called consolidation. The idea being that a memory comes in and the hippocampus retrieves it either while the animal or person is awake or even while they're sleeping, we think, and cements that by repeating it over and over again to these other areas until they can remember it without a hippocampus, all right? And we know that's the case because think about EP, right? When he was asked, how would you, if you were lost in the woods, what would you do? He instantly was able to answer, oh, I would find a river and follow it downstream, right? So he clearly knows a lot. He can talk a lot about electronics and everything else, but what he can't do is form new memories, right? So this stuff is still there, this part is gone, okay? All right, so that's the basic picture. And now what I want to do is tell you a little more about specifically what we do in my lab to actually try and figure out at a very detailed level how in the world that works. All right, and we study this in rats, and we do that because we can look inside their brains at patterns of brain activity to understand how it is that they create new memories and perhaps how they retrieve them. So the first thing I need to tell you about are these things called place fields, all right? So one of the remarkable things about the rat brain, and it turns out this seems to be true for the human brain as well, is that in the hippocampus, you find brain cells that are responsive to where the animal or where the person is in space. And so the first question is, well, why would you find that? And it turns out, if you think about it, well, where do our experiences happen? Right? They happen in space, right? They always happen in a place. You will remember this, at least to some degree, in the context of being in this room and being at Berkeley and so on and so forth. And so if we put an electrode down next to these cells and we measure their activity, we can see that each one cares about where the animal is. So if you imagine that this was a little track that the animal was running along, and each of these circles is the part of space that one of these neurons cares about. And when you measure activity from brain cells, what you see are little things that are called spikes. They're when one neuron is sending a signal down to the other. And so we might imagine that we get this pattern, all on the time scale of the animal's experience. All right? So you can think of the patterns of activity in the brain during experience as the things that need to be written in so that they can be remembered later. All right? Okay, so this is what you happen to see in the hippocampus. As I say, we think you see things like this in the human hippocampus as well, in the cases that people have been able to look. And so now we want to ask the question, well, what would a memory of that look like? All right. So we think this is important for, as I said, storing these memories. And there's another pattern of activity we see. It's called a sharp wave ripple. I'm just mentioning that in case there's any sort of aficionados in the audience. But the important thing about this pattern is that we can see the same sorts of sequences that we saw before played out. So bum. But now, instead of taking a couple of seconds, this might take, in this case, about 1/10 of a second. All right? Now this might seem a little odd, but I'm going to sort of explain why we think this is actually perhaps what a memory is, this little sequence. And so I want to show you sort of one example of real data which kind of explains how this works. So here's recordings from an animal, and this is the animal hanging out after an experience, and it's in a little rest box, and so it gets in there and it wanders around, and that's what all these gray dots are. And then this red to the yellow to the green is about a 15-second chunk of time where the animal walks around, pauses for a moment, and looks for all the world like it's thinking. Now it's a rat, right? So we don't know whether we're allowed to use that word or not, but it looks like it's thinking, and then it keeps going, okay? Now importantly, when it's wandering around, the cells in its hippocampus are kind of telling you where it is in the box. They're recording its current experience or telling you what it's doing right now. But when it stops, that activity kind of goes away, and we see this sequence. So each of these is one neuron, and each of these is sort of a spike of that neuron from this place that the animal was in 20 minutes ago. Okay? It's like the animal's brain starts thinking about some other place, and we can sort of read the animal's mind. Even though it's not moving, we can ask, well, what's it thinking about? All right? And so we can go back to the patterns of brain activity we recorded before, and we can say, well, let's pretend the animal was moving through space. What would it be doing? And it turns out when we do this, we get this pattern. That doesn't really matter. But it turns out the animal is remembering that. Okay? So it is, in about 1/5 of a second, remembering this experience it had in this W-shaped track while it's sitting here. Okay? So this looks a lot like your ability to sit here in this room and remember where you were at breakfast. All right? So this is a pattern of brain activity that looks like mental time travel, looks like exactly what we saw in, that wonderful clip at the beginning from Ratatouille, this experience of mentally going to some other place, another time, and remembering what that was like. All right? And so the nice thing about this is now we're starting to get some insight into what a memory might be in the brain, what it actually looks like, and therefore we can ask the question, well, are we right? Is this really important for something? So one thing we did then was to take these patterns of activity and turn them off. All right, so we built a system that let us detect when this was happening, right when it happened, and then to just turn off those patterns, but leave all the rest of the activity unaffected. All right, so it's like we're sort of removing these mental time travels without changing anything else. And when we did that, we found that when we disrupted these events and we looked at an animal's ability to learn, we found that those animals were kind of messed up. They couldn't learn well anymore. All right, and that's compared to these other animals which were learning just fine. So here we have a situation where we've taken these mental time travel events, taken them out, but left all that regular activity alone, and now the animals don't seem to be able to learn very well anymore. They don't seem to be able to remember what they're supposed to do and where they're supposed to go next. All right? So this is kind of the approach that we and many others are taking to try and actually understand how the brain works. Can we identify what's going on in the brain when, say, a memory was retrieved? Can we then understand what is that good for? All right. And I wanted to mention then that this is basically getting rid of these events impairs decision making. So this is giving us a hint that we might understand something. And then I want to sort of talk about, well, what are these things good for? So this is the sort of the next bit, which I think is really something that I find sort of interesting to think about. So if we ask, why do we have this? Right? Why is it that we can all store memories for the events of daily life? Why does this matter, right? Does it really matter what you had for breakfast? Does it really matter how you got here? And so if we think about this, it's like, well, it's pretty clear that our memories are important for figuring out what we need to do next, all right? And when we think about what that means, if we say that explicitly, we would, well, I'll come back to that in just a moment. When we think about, okay, what are you going to do after this, right? Well, how do you make that decision, right? How did you decide to come here in the first place, right? So what you do, and what you literally do, is you think to yourself, what will it be like if I go there? Will I learn something interesting? Will this be useful? And how do you make that decision? Well, you use your memory of other events to imagine what it would be like, all right? So this is really what our memories are for, and I think this is one of the sort of fun things, is that memory is about being able to imagine the future. It's about being able to use your past experience to imagine what's going to happen next so that you can make a decision, right? And that's really sort of the point. That's why we have these things at some level. That's why they're useful to our ancestors. Oh, that's where the bear was. Let's not go there again, right? Because I imagine that if I went there again, that would be a dangerous place to go. And one of the exciting things for us is that the hippocampus often replays, that is, reactivates these memories that don't just look like a memory, they look like something the animal could do next. So it really looks like the system is remembering things, but it's remembering things so it can construct versions of the future. So it can say, what's going to happen if I do that? What's going to happen if I do this? And I think this is kind of fun because it really sort of points out that there's actually a very strong link between memory and imagination. All right? Our ability to imagine is our ability to take things that we've learned, things that we remember, and construct them together in new ways. All right? And if you can't remember, you can't actually imagine. All right? And so what we're trying to understand then is, can we get at what imagination actually looks like in the brain, at least to the extent that our little rats have imagination? All right. And finally, I just wanted to mention why, if you don't even care about the science, should you care about this? All right? So this is something that I always find a little disturbing. This is one thing that, of course, we all know about with memory, is that it's severely impaired in aging and particularly in Alzheimer's. Right? So this is one example. And this is a particular institute, US Against Alzheimer's, estimate of what this is going to cost this country over the next, say, 50 years. And so the thought is that as the number of people with Alzheimer's goes up to 12 million or so, you end up with this costing around $1 trillion a year to take care of these people, right? Now that's about double the estimate of the National Institute of Health, but it's kind of in that area. And so that's really scary, right? That really sort of makes you think, oh my God, how are we going to do this? This little yellow bar here is the current amount of money going to research this, to actually try and fix it, okay? And that's specifically Alzheimer's, so I added for myself, this is the entire budget of the National Institute of Health, which is aimed at curing cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's and everything else. It's currently about $31 billion. All right? So as a scientist, I look at these numbers and I feel like, of course, in a slightly biased and way, this doesn't make a lot of sense. All right? And so for me, when I think about how fundamental our memories are to who we are, right? And I think about the things that rob us of those memories, things like Alzheimer's, which are truly devastating. I think, why are we not doing more to try and fix this? All right? And I sort of just want to leave you with that I think if when one thinks about how fundamental these things are and where our priorities are, and you sort of look at numbers like this, you wonder, why are we putting money where we're putting money? All right, so I'll leave you with that. Thanks.